you, Doctor.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. We're now going to open it up for questions, give you the opportunity to ask the doctor anything you like. We'll start right here. We have people with microphones on both sides. We can start with this gentleman and this lady right here in the aisle.
Thanks.
Hi. Can you tell me if you've done any funding or plan to do funding for early onset Alzheimer's? And can you give a little brief history of what's been going on with that in the past year or two?
So early onset Alzheimer's basically is a rare disease. It probably accounts for less than 1% of the cases. These are people that get the illness in their 40s or 50s, and they have a mutation, primarily in the amyloid gene, that makes them produce more of that amyloid, and they get Alzheimer's disease. We think that that's a different disease than the sporadic form. It kind of relates because it's amyloid, but we don't necessarily know that when we develop treatments for the genetic form of the disease, that they're going to be useful for the disease that people get in late life. It's rare, but there are a number of clinical trials going on to treat these people with the genetic disease. And I think part of the scientific interest in that is to see if these drugs that we have that are against the amyloid actually work in human beings. But I don't think necessarily there'll be wide application from studies that we see in people that have the genetic form of the disease with a mutation. Yes.
Howard, first I want to compliment you on an excellent summary of what's going on in terms of the research.
Thank you.
I have a question. Looking at ApoE4, what was interesting to me is that a number of years ago there was a large retrospective observational study that suggested that those on statins had a lower incidence of Alzheimer's. Given the link with cholesterol, do you think that if statins weren't the blockbuster drug product that they are today, that Alzheimer's would be an even larger problem?
I'll give you two answers. First of all, a friend of mine named Larry Sparks at the Banner at the Sun Health Research Institute in Phoenix, Arizona, came to me about 10 years ago. And he said that he had noticed that heart disease was associated with Alzheimer's, and he wanted to use a statin to treat Alzheimer's disease. And he went to all the companies, and none of them would give him any money. So we gave him $750,000 to do a clinical trial of Lipitor for Alzheimer's disease. Now, when Pfizer heard that there was going to be a clinical trial of Lipitor, all of a sudden they got involved, and they put in like another $3 million. And Larry did a preliminary trial. It showed an effect of Lipitor in Alzheimer's disease. Pfizer went on to do a clinical trial of Lipitor for 3,000 people with Alzheimer's disease, and there was no effect. Now, it may be that we treated too late, and maybe we have to get into prevention. And I do think that there's still interest, I would say, in using statins. The main link is that there is a vascular component to Alzheimer's disease. I think that's emerging. That, the hypertension story that I told you, there is a vascular component. Maybe when brain cells get ischemic, they overproduce the amyloid, and it's just a byproduct, and it's telling us that the brain cells are dying. So there is a clear link, an association between heart disease and Alzheimer's disease, for example. So I think that by using Lipitor to prevent the vascular component of this, especially for prevention, that Lipitor will potentially reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease later on. In the back.
Your chart on drug discovery and the fact that this is a pure play is very enlightening. I wonder if you could mention what % of drug discovery is funded by ADDF?
Okay, actually I had a slide on this to give you an order of magnitude. Again, as a result of that survey that was done by the National Institute on Aging, between 2008 and 2011, ADDF gave out about $13 million for drug discovery, not biology, not basic research, drug discovery. The Alzheimer's Association, and they're friends of ours, we work together, so I'm not saying anything negative here, just the facts, gave, during that same period, reported $7 million. The VA, the Department of Veterans Affairs, which takes care of millions of old veterans, gave away $1.5 million. And the National Institute on Aging, which has a $1 billion budget, and the National Institute on Health, which has a $28 billion budget, gave out about $60 million. So we gave out 12, and the National Institute on Aging gave out 60 million. So order of magnitude, not that far off. So we need to raise more money. We want to do more clinical trials. There's a lot more work to be done, but order of magnitude, I think we're playing an important role.
So you're about 15%.
15% of total, okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor. I was excited to hear about Lipitor.
Okay.
Could you please go into a few of these midlife strategies that you were suggesting that we could all benefit from?
Well, first of all, let me say that with that scan that I told you about, the amyloid scan, we've discovered that Alzheimer's disease starts about 20 years before people start having symptoms. And so our change in thinking now is that this isn't a disease of old age. It's a disease of midlife. Kind of interesting. And on the prevention side, I'll give you a couple examples. One is exercise. I have a slide on that I didn't show you. But we know that of all the things that we can do to prevent Alzheimer's disease, and this was an NIH statement, exercise, physical exercise, is the best way to protect your brain. Now, all of us probably think right off this is just a blood flow thing, but actually it may not be. When we exercise, we release neuroprotective factors. One of the most powerful neuroprotective factors that we know of is called BDNF. And we funded, in about 2004, we funded Art Kramer at the University of Illinois to look at this. And what he did was he took 50, 75-year-olds who were old, and he brought them into a center, and they stretched, and they socialized. And then he took another 50, 75-year-olds, and they stretched, and they socialized, and they went for a brisk walk for 45 minutes 3 times a week. At the beginning of the study, he did brain scans, MRIs on everybody, and psychometrics. He tested in depth their psychological function. And at the end of 6 months, he repeated those tests. What he found was that the people who didn't exercise, who didn't take that 45-minute walk, their brains shrunk according to what we think of as normal aging, which is about 0.4% a year, and their cognitive function went down. And the people who exercised actually increased in their cognitive function, and their brain cells improved. He then went on, and we suggested that he look at the blood and see if BDNF was increased. And sure enough, there was a direct correlation between fitness and exercise. And what we're doing to translate into the new drugs is that when I reported this to our board, Mr. Ronald Lauder said to me, you know, Howard, I'm a couch potato. You got to develop me a pill that I can take. And that's what we're doing at Stanford University. Frank Longo has a pill that he's developing that's a BDNF type of drug. We helped Frank spin out a biotech company. He started off 10 years ago trying to develop these drugs, screening 2 million molecules. He found one, and that one drug was just approved by the FDA to go into clinical trials, and he's done safety studies. It's safe, and now we're trying to raise money to help Frank go into phase 2 and see if this mimic of BDNF that can be taken orally, the most powerful neuroprotective factor, will protect Alzheimer's disease. The second thing I'll talk about is DHA. As I mentioned, 97% of the omega-3 fatty acids in the brain are DHA. And the DHA plays an important role in the insulation of the connection. So if you think about a copper wire doesn't conduct electricity unless it's insulated. And basically the same thing is true in the brain. And much of that insulation involves DHA and myelin and other fatty proteins. There have been studies to show that most of us are probably DHA deficient. The people who are most DHA deficient have poor cognitive function, and that DHA supplementation helps us to think. There's actually a clinical trial done by a company called Martech in people with normal aging. They had memory problems, and the supplementation with DHA actually improved their cognitive function. Diet's very important, so don't be obese. Obesity is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, probably because it causes a lot of inflammation. Mediterranean diet may be protective. Don't drink a lot of alcohol. Don't smoke because it causes a lot of oxidation and toxins to the brain. Head trauma is emerging as a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Head trauma in childhood might be a risk factor for late life Alzheimer's disease. So I guess that's a partial answer. Thank you very
What are
much.
some of the foods that have the highest source of DHA and omega?
Well, basically the same foods, fish, and people can take fish oil, but there is a purified form of DHA on the market today from that same company, Martech, which is actually made not from fish but from algae, and it doesn't contain any of the contaminants, and you can get a high dose of the DHA. So you can either take omega-3 or you can take the purified DHA.
You have a question back here?
I have been working with the Blue Brain Project in Switzerland, and the government gave $3 billion towards the study of the brain. I'm sure you're aware of it.
Yeah.
Spain gave $60 million. My feeling is on the fundraising side. This is interesting for me, perhaps, because I'm at the UN working with all these heads of state and organizations to see if we can correlate some of what they're doing, what you're doing. Their aim sometimes, like the Sheikh of Qatar, she's built a hospital just for autism, but probably some of those cause and effects can be helped by your clinical trials and the medical attention that you're giving. So I would like to look into that when anyone has some time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Wondering
Yes,
if you
sir.
could give us your opinion on the benefits of nutraceuticals and if any of the products that are out there now are, or anything in the pipeline is potentially disease modifying?
Yeah, so actually nutraceuticals are quite interesting, and we have funded a few projects dedicated to developing nutraceuticals. There's a lot of advantages to nutraceuticals. They can be rapidly brought to market. They're generally safe. People can take them quite easily. Mother Nature generally made them, so it has good biology. There are very interesting compounds in coffee and caffeine that we've looked at. Vitamins are really important. We now know that vitamin D plays a very important role in the brain, and people that are vitamin D deficient may have cognitive impairment. Vitamin B, both B1, B6, and B12. Recently, there have been a couple of studies showing that people who get multivitamin B vitamin supplementation, their brains shrink at a slower rate than people who don't take B12 vitamin supplementation. And we actually have a program right now that we're considering using a derivative of B1 as a nutraceutical, and we've been advising with our regulatory experts on how one could develop nutraceuticals for Alzheimer's disease. So I think nutraceuticals are a very important component of what we should be doing, both in terms of trying to rapidly bring treatments to market for people, but also in learning from these nutraceuticals about developing new chemical entities that would be even more effective than, sort of building on Mother Nature itself to develop drugs for Alzheimer's disease. So I think nutraceuticals are quite interesting.
I'm told we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
Ma'am.
Okay. Anybody? Yes.
Thank you, Doctor, so much for your comments. They were so helpful because I'm actually personally immersed in a situation with a family member who has dementia, and so I observe every day the deterioration. And I have more of an observation rather than a question, because I find that in the world surrounding the elderly, it's so little underreported, and there's very little public awareness. And I thought your comments about the Alzheimer's Association was very relevant because I've run into similar situation. But what I just want to point out is that I find that even the caregivers who are supposed to be aware of how to treat and care for elderly people are so undereducated and so uninformed, and it's really a huge problem. And as people age, it's going to be so much more important, and obviously, that's what you're commenting on right now, but I just wanted to put it out there as far as my own personal observation.
Well, you're absolutely right. When I started in the field in 1979, I had been a doctor for, 6 or 7 years at that point, and I never heard of Alzheimer's disease. And when I told people that I was interested in the field and I was going to go into it, they never heard of it. They said, "What is old-timers disease? We never heard of old-timers disease." So, starting from that point, because I've been doing this a while, the awareness today amazes me. And I think we've come a really long way. Caregiving for Alzheimer's disease is tremendously stressful, takes tremendous time and effort and money. I think the Alzheimer's Association has done a wonderful job in educating people, around the country, and other foundations have done a good job. We need more doctors in the field. because we need doctors to take care of people with Alzheimer's disease. We need more neurologists and geriatricians and psychiatrists to go into caring for people, because a lot of times caregiver education comes from doctors or social workers and nurses and people like that. So I personally think we've come a long way, but at the end of the day, taking care of someone with Alzheimer's disease is really hard. And even with all the education, you're still faced with those daily challenges of agitation and behavior problems and memory problems, and then you get into long-term care with feeding, and it's very important to educate people, but it's also important for us to have community resources to help caregivers to get through the day. Okay, one more. Yeah.
Hi. One thing you didn't talk about was beta secretase, and I was wondering if you could maybe talk about BACE inhibitors, such as Merck's that's in phase 2,
Sure.
and whether or not you think that these can be disease modifying.
Well, so beta secretase is an enzyme that cuts the amyloid protein out of a larger protein, and ADDF actually helped to discover one of the first beta secretase inhibitors through the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation about 10 years ago. I would say that the beta secretase inhibitors are probably going to be one of the last bastions of big pharma testing drugs to attack the amyloid. All the vaccines to try to clear the amyloid have failed so far. There's still a couple of trials going on. The gamma secretase inhibitors, which was another enzyme, have failed so far, maybe mostly because of side effects. The beta secretase inhibitors potentially might have side effects that will prevent them from coming to market. And we just have to wait and see what the phase 3 trials that Merck is doing and other companies with beta secretase inhibitors will turn out. I mean, this is why we need to do the experiments, and we need to do the experiments ultimately in human beings. So I don't have any, I'm a scientist, I'm not going to give you any beliefs or judgments or anything. I want to see the data. And so Merck is going to spend probably $1 billion testing a beta secretase inhibitor, and I hope it works. Thank you very much.